Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and on the American Jewish scene today, among the sensitive and complex and controversial issues in the forefront of Jewish life is the role J Street is playing when it comes to Israel. J Street calls itself pro-Israel, pro-peace. Many American Jews disagree with that description. Recently, J Street applied for membership in the umbrella organization of Jewish life, the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. To be accepted for membership, 2/3 of the participating 50 or so organizations must vote in favor. J Street received less than 50% of the votes, and their application was denied. But this vote reflects the controversial status of J Street on the American Jewish scene. While a majority of conference members voted against including J Street in what is now euphemistically called the Big Tent, there were a number of significant responsible Jewish voices who thought J Street does belong in the tent, including the National Director of the Anti-Defamation League, Abe Foxman. But many in the Jewish community believe J Street has fooled a lot of people, especially young people on college campuses, and that J Street has turned Jewish co-eds against the Jewish state, portraying Israel as the obstacle to peace and as a nation guilty of all kinds of human rights abuses. And now a film has been produced which seeks to show the truth about J Street. It's entitled The J Street Challenge, The Seductive Allure of Peace in Our Time. The executive producer, writer, and director of the J Street Challenge is Avi Goldwasser, co-founder of the David Project, which seeks to educate students on campus with respect to Israel. And Avi Goldwasser also is responsible for a superb film on Jews expelled from Arab lands, The Forgotten Refugees. And another co-founder of the David Project, who was a special consultant on the J Street Challenge, is my guest on this edition of L'Chaim. It's a pleasure to introduce you to Charles Jacobs, who is also the founder of Americans for Peace and Tolerance, which he heads today. And Charles is currently touring the country with the film The J Street Challenge. And Charles, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
By the way, you're in this area now because you're going to be showing the film on June 26th as we tape.
On June 26th, at the Loewy's Lincoln AMC Theater.
Yes, between
7
67th and 68th on Broadway.
Right. The wonderful organization CAMRA and my organization, Americans for Peace and Tolerance. Also co-sponsoring us is ZOA and Stand With Us and all the good people. We're going to be screening the New York premiere of the J Street Challenge.
Okay, and that's again
Thursday,
June
26th. 7 o'clock.
Okay.
And people can buy their tickets at our website, thejstreetchallenge.com.
Very.
You need the the.
You need the
J Street.
Okay. First, talk to me about you. Who are you, Charles? And how did you become so involved in Jewish life? Where were you born?
I was born in Newark, New Jersey.
Huh?
Actually.
To what kind of Jewish home?
Actually, not a very Jewish home. Jewish parents,
Yes.
non-practicing, lefties. My life a bit parallels David Horowitz in that score. I grew up as a very liberal Jewish fellow. Went to Rutgers Newark, where education was about $500 a semester, and it was marvelous. We actually did have liberal arts that mattered and that counted and that celebrated Western civilization. So that's gone. My part of Newark, New Jersey is also gone.
So your home was basically secular Jewish and culturally Jewish?
Secular Jewish and partially culturally Jewish.
Okay. Did you care about Israel growing up?
No.
That's honest.
I did not.
When did it change for you?
Well, it changed for me. I was a member of the left. I went on Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, gives you my age. And I belonged to the NAACP at Newark Rutgers. And later on, when I went to Brandeis, home of Herbert Marcuse and Angela Davis, I became a very far left person.
What were you doing at Brandeis?
I was studying psychology.
Was this
in
postgraduate?
graduate school.
I see.
In graduate school.
Did you get a degree from Brandeis?
I did not.
Okay.
I dropped out so I could organize workers in a shoe factory in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
You were a real leftist.
I was a real leftist.
Okay.
And what changed me was when the left turned against Israel. That's what changed me. It made no sense to me that they were saying, well, the solution to the conflict is that the Arab workers, the Arab working class, and the Jewish working class will come together to be together against the oppressive colonialists, imperialists, etc. And I thought that makes absolutely no sense. It would never, ever happen. Of course, we now have a kind of a fainter version of that, of global citizenry and all of and kumbaya, etc. But I knew that that was a big, terrible mistake.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And roughly how old are you then? At what point? I don't know. In what decade does this happen for you?
This happens for me in the late 60s.
Late 60s. So for you it happened early then.
Yes.
Okay. You have your own, or you were involved with the David Project.
First of all, I helped start Camera, and the Camera,
That's
the
right,
Boston branch of Camera with
right.
Andrea Levin.
Tell people what Camera is. It is one of the most important organizations on the Jewish scene today.
Let me back up for a second.
Sure.
Okay. There was a shift and a shock to the Jewish soul in America when the enemies of the Jews stopped being the predominant enemies were no longer the Nazis and the Christian anti-Semites and the skinheads, but changed to be the leftist anti-Israelists and the jihadi or Islamic radicals or Islamic Judeophobes. When that shift happened, we were unprepared. And whereas before we had a Defense Department for the Jews, right? We have the federations, you might say, are the welfare department. They collect money for non-controversial Jewish basics,
Jewish Family Service.
Jewish Family Service and education and continuity in the poor. And when the enemy was the Nazis, we had a Defense Department, and that was called the ADL, right? And it worked pretty well. But when the new enemy came, that is the new anti-Semitism, which is that they no longer hate us because we killed Jesus, mostly in the West. There are some. And they no longer hate us mostly because we're racial vermin, like the Nazis said. They hate us because of the apartheid state of Israel. This is new, right? And they hate us in the Muslim world because we're rebellious dhimmi people. We're rebellious people who should be subjected to Islamic law and made Israel as a state. So what happened was the ADL kind of disappeared. They didn't want to take that on. They did not take that on. And so there was a gap. And I was there exactly when that happened. And that's when Camera and then later Stand With Us, and then later the David Project, and always the ZOA, and then later Hasbara Fellows. These are organizations that ran in to fill that gap. Okay, and that's really when Camera got started. And then I was there in Boston, and Andrea Levin headed it up, and I helped her. Camera is Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America, and it is the preeminent media watchdog that shows exactly how the media cheats on Israel.
Okay, that's number one. And now, what about you and the David Project? How did that happen? Before that? Okay.
Before that, I found that, much to my shock and horror, that Arabs had black slaves, continue to have black slaves, and that nobody cares much. And I read, and I went to Amnesty International, and I found out that in Sudan, Africa's largest nation, the Arab North was raiding the black, mostly Christian South. They were storming African villages, shooting the men and taking the women and children as slaves. And I couldn't believe, a man who was on Martin Luther King's march, I couldn't believe that A, it was happening, and B, worse, that precisely the people you would have thought would be screaming about this, that is Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, they were quiet. And so I determined that at some point I was going to make that my mission. I wrote and published my first piece in the New York Times, my op-ed in the New York Times, along with a Muslim fellow, called Bought and Sold. And we wrote about the ample documentation of Arab enslavement of blacks. And for 10 years, I worked on that. I helped redeem slaves in Sudan. I brought a rabbi with me, an Orthodox rabbi from Boston University,
Who?
Joseph Pollack, and his wife, Razel. We went to Sudan on Pesach, and we witnessed the redemption of slaves. And we made all of the connections between our people and their people. Sudan is the world's newest nation. South Sudan broke away from the north and became an ally of Israel. Now it's mired in unfortunate tribal conflict. But that's the second thing I did. I was awarded by Martin Luther King's widow the Boston Freedom Award for my work in redeeming slaves. I work with Christians who led the effort to redeem the slaves and who are now leading the effort to save the Christians of Iraq and the Christians of Syria.
It's remarkable work, Charles. Mazal Tov, Yasher Koach. Okay, from there.
The David Project. So it seemed to me I was working in Sudan and had gone there several times illegally to redeem the slaves, and I thought the Dinka people, these are the tribes that are mostly attacked, tall, beautiful, black, gorgeous people. They're the Jews of our time because the world, you had a fascist government attacking them and the world sat on its hands, and I felt very, as a Jew, moved. And then I saw what was happening in Israel, and I said, no. The Jews are the Jews of our time again, and we don't understand. We think that criticism of Israel is legitimate. We don't understand that these are existential, rhetorical attacks on us. Our children are not prepared for what's going to happen on the college campuses, even in Jewish day schools. My kids, by now I was married, and I married an Orthodox girl, and so I came over. And my kids were attending, my two daughters were attending Maimonides, an Orthodox Jewish day school. And even there, the kids were not prepared for what they had to face on the campuses. So I started the David Project with Avi Goldwasser, who's my partner.
And, a thumbnail description of the David Project.
The David Project existed to come to the aid of Jewish kids on campus. The first thing that we did, which is kind of well known, we stopped Harvard University from taking a $2 million grant from an anti-Semitic sheikh. And we found a wonderful Jewish heroine, Rachel Fish, who stood up to her dean at Harvard and forced the issue. But then we thought, and this is still very important, once the kids are on campus, they're too busy to learn so much, and they're very pressed and stressed. So it would be better to prepare Jewish kids in the Jewish high schools. So we created a curriculum, and it was in, at one point, 120 Jewish day schools across the country and in Canada. That was a whole curriculum that prepared them to make rhetorical defenses of Israel.
You were helping young people become advocates for the state of Israel,
yes,
and to be able to answer the charges and challenges they would face when they got on campus.
Right, and more than that, to think about going on the offensive.
Mm-hmm.
That's the problem we
have. Okay, how do you become involved in the J Street Challenge?
So after the David Project, I formed with Avi Goldwasser again, Americans for Peace and Tolerance, because we found out that there was a mosque going up in Boston that was Saudi funded, and it was going to be led by radical Islamists. And we thought no one was taking this on, and that's what we do. We finger in the dike. We rush to where the Jewish community's leadership is not there yet or failing. And we started to document that, and then we also continued our work on the campuses. J Street raises inordinately important issues for the Jewish community.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to be pro-Israel? What are the rights and obligations and duties of the Jewish diaspora vis-a-vis Israel and its problems? And J Street raises those issues in a way that we thought were a bit dishonest. And J Street was once it started to get into the big tent, predominating the discussion in many venues in America. They had town halls. They were going into Jewish community centers and synagogues, and their spokesmen are very articulate. These people are lawyers and PR specialists and seasoned left-wing activists, and who would show up in synagogues and on campuses and making speeches. And the Jewish community, it's very hard for a local person to call up Alan Dershowitz and say, well, come here and debate J Street or Ruth Weiss or Rabbi Gordis. So we made the film in order to solve the problem of how, at the local level, Jews who were worried about J Street but didn't quite know how to debate them or couldn't get preeminent, eloquent people to do it. So we made this film.
Okay. At the moment, there is an overwhelming sense in the Jewish world that there is no honest interlocutor on the other side, no real Palestinian leadership, whether it's Fatah or Hamas, that is serious about living side by side with the State of Israel in peace. But my question for you is not what is the reality today. My question for you in front of the Shalom TV audience is, philosophically, conceptually, if there were an interlocutor, if you believe that there were Palestinians on the West Bank who were really absolutely ready to live side by side with the State of Israel in peace, would you be in favor of a two-state solution?
I'll give you a Jewish answer. Okay, maybe. And I have to.
But in all honesty, I've never heard that as a Jewish answer.
Okay.
I've heard yes and no at the same time.
Okay,
But
well,
never maybe.
Yes and no. Yes and no. So first of all, there are probably, I believe, many.
I just want to know what the maybe is no. Maybe means you're not committed to it. I want to know what about the two-state solution bothers Charles Jacobs, if there were a real people who wanted to live honestly in peace side by side, and no Israeli parent, no Israeli grandparent would ever have to worry about the safety of their child. Why would you be against that?
But this is like asking,
I know
if the
it
sky
is.
were black,
I know. We'll get to what color the sky really is.
So if
And by the way, I want to answer that because I want our audience to understand why. There's a historical progression here. There's a historical reality that no American Jew should fail to understand. In the 1930s, 37, 38, the Peel Commission, instituted by the British when they had the mandate to administer Palestine on its way to becoming the Jewish homeland, the British realized that there were peoples in Palestine who were not prepared to live together. And they suggested, their recommendation was a partition plan. The Peel Commission gave a partition plan in the late 1930s. Right. And the Yeshuv, David Ben-Gurion, the formal Jewish community, while there were those who dissented, the formal Jewish community said, yeah, you know what? We'll share the land. And there are two peoples here. And we understand the notion. And if they're willing to share the land, we're willing to share the land. That has been the formal position of the Jewish people from 1938 to this day. And therefore, I want to say to any Jew who sits at this table, do you share Ben-Gurion's vision that although, of course, we would like all of Eretz Yisrael to be Israel, the way to solve a problem, a human dilemma, is we are prepared to share the land. So I ask you, if there were a real peaceful interlocutor, and you and I agree there is none. Yeah. But I want to know conceptually where you stand. Yeah. So I don't understand why there's a maybe.
Okay, so because the maybe has to do with not only, as you say, there isn't one now, but also what about the future? What about the future? I actually wrote and published in the Boston Globe and in the Atlanta Constitution a plan for a two-state solution, but it was what we call the double column plan. If Israel, I thought, and not just me, but many people in Israel, would annex the Jordan Valley, right, so that ISIS couldn't march through Jerusalem, then we could give the Palestinians in the rest of the West Bank and in Gaza a polity that would be very, very close to a state, maybe without an army. I still might hope someday that could happen. So the maybe has to do with what happens in the Arab world is that you can never say that what is will be in the future, right? So if you make yourself defenseless on the basis that now that we found these Arab neighbors who really want to live in peace, we can be assured forever that will be the way it is, and that the rest of the Muslim world will let it be, then okay, but we can't.
Then okay?
Then okay, but then yes.
But that's all you have to say, it
Okay.
seems to me. The answer is yes.
Well-
But by the way, I don't think it's practical. I don't think it's reasonable. I don't think it's realistic. I don't think it'll ever happen. But yes, if the Messiah came and said that from now on,
Sure.
the
But
answer
you
is
see-
sure now.
Sure, but
Okay.
but it's meaningless.
No, it is not, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Because I want to then come to the movie.
Okay.
And by the way, if you get a chance to see the movie, it is a very interesting presentation, not simply of the J Street, what J Street's role is on the contemporary American scene. And I do want to talk to Charles about that in a moment. But for people who don't know, for people who do not have a real familiarity with the history of Palestine as it becomes Israel, and then what happens to the state of Israel from 1948 through 67, and then through 67 to 73 and up to the present time. One of the things this film does, and I believe it is the strength of the film, as you'll hear me discuss it with Charles in a moment, I found some of the things about J Street problematic in the film. What I don't find problematic is it is a marvelous summary with great footage and some great animations that would show anyone who is unfamiliar with the events that occurred in this part of the region. And the reality is that the Jewish people are in a war. They've been in a war with the Arab world at least since the 1920s, when the Arabs massacred people in Hebron, massacred the Jews of Hebron, and then there was massacres in the Etzion block, et cetera, et cetera. But there's been a war going on between Arabs and Jews, and the movie makes that point. There's one eloquent person who says that this is about one long war that precedes the establishment of the State of Israel, and that's why it's very difficult to make peace right now. So if you want to see a film which really will help you put so much history into perspective for you and maybe give you information. I almost wished there were parts of the film that were in more detail and would go longer. But as a film that just encapsulates the history of this region, the J Street Challenge coincidentally does that marvelously. And one of the things that's important for anybody to understand is that the Jewish people have been prepared to share the land and have never been given the opportunity. And I believe that the Israeli people, you and I, most American Jews understand that. At the same time, Charles, there are many American Jews, but well-meaning, thoughtful, not crazy leftists, who think we're wrong and who believe that there can be peace, and that peace is an evolutionary process. And this notion which the movie has, I don't understand why you put it in there. Anybody who agrees that there should be a two-state solution is going to create the problem where if there's an army that wants to march across the Jordan River and against the border of the State of Israel, they can do that. And that was true in 1960 up until 1967. And there are many people, even in Israel, generals in Israel, who are not worried about that. It's not as if it's black and white when it comes to that kind of issue. But I wanted to set the context for what the film is trying to do and what the film is trying to say. And one of the things I really want to get to is I want to understand what your real objection is to J Street.
Sure.
And does it come through enough in the film? I have my own real concerns about J Street, but I also feel it's my responsibility to ask you questions which somebody who on the left might say to you, wait a minute, I'll give you this film, but what about this, this, and this? And I want to talk to you about that.
Sure.
But I thought it was important for you first to give us a sense of where you are in terms of the overall fact that there's a conflict between two peoples in this land, and I think you and I see it very, very similarly, that this is a much larger battle than simply a battle over a border. This has nothing to do with a border. This has nothing to do with a border. And the J Street Challenge movie does make that point. Now, I've spoken for a few moments. What do you want to say?
Okay, so it's not a border war.
Right.
It's not a border war. And, in our film, Brett Stevens, who may be one of the more right-wing conceived of as one of the more right-wing people, he says, if on the other side of the Green Line or whatever are people like Canadians, then sure, then fine. Okay, and that's what I meant
point,
to
isn't
say.
it?
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant point.
And I'm glad you have it in the movie.
So what I think our problem with J Street is simply three major objections. We have three major objections. The first is they blame Israel. They blame, just like Israel's adversaries.
Okay. By the way, you understand you don't show that in the film. You don't show that.
That J Street blames
yes,
Israel?
One of the, and I'm, by the way, the fact of the film is an important film. But I want you to understand that you do some things really well in this film. You never show them blaming Israel.
Okay.
You have people saying they blame Israel.
Right.
But one of the problems that I had, and this is a problem for any documentary writer, is that if you want, it seems to me that one has a responsibility, not to say something about, but to let the organization one is writing about, or one is filming about, or one is telling a story about. I have to see that happen. Yeah. So it doesn't matter to me what Carolyn Glick says about J Street. I want to hear Jeremy Ben-Ami say it. And because I made this point earlier than I thought I would, at one point you have the vice president of J Street.
Daniel Levy.
Daniel Levy, right? You have him on camera. And that was a brilliant piece of film. Because what you do there is you let the viewer see what J Street says in its own voice. Mm-hmm. And that's what I want you to talk about. I want you to talk about now, I don't care what you think of J Street. I want you to tell me what you can show us about J Street, that J Street does, or J Street says, in J Street's own words, that should trouble American Jews in ways that perhaps it doesn't. What can you show me they say or do that bothers you?
Okay, say or do. So let's do first. They took money from people who were anti-Semitic. They took money from people who were anti-Israel. They were launched by George Soros, who blames Israel for anti-Semitism, who's given money to people and organizations that are anti-Israel, who is the wisest investor perhaps in the world because of all of his billions and his money shenanigans or investments, and they took it and they lied about it.
Okay. By the way, it is the single most important point made in the movie. I say this now gently. I wish it had come at the front of the movie, not at the back of the movie. I don't know why.
Can I say?
Why did he put it at the end of the movie? But it is so important. Yeah. We're going to put it right up there. I want you to see this part of the movie, which I think Charles is 100% right about. This is one of the essential points the movie makes. It's about a 2-minute, 3-minute clip. I want you to see it, and Charles is going to watch with us, and then you'll comment.
J Street's activity, supposedly as a pro-Israel organization, is somewhat of a puzzle, because some of the activity doesn't seem to be pro-Israel in its nature. Why they would oppose sanctions against Iran if they're pro-Israel is beyond me. Why they would refuse to support Israel's operation into Gaza after Israel was pummeled by rockets and missiles from Gaza for years. Again, a question I cannot answer. Why they would oppose a U.S. veto in the United Nations of a resolution that would attack Israel? Again, I don't understand why this organization calls itself pro-Israel. So I went looking at whatever public documents there were. And suddenly I understood why early on, about 2 or 3 years ago, J Street was opposed to sanctions against Iran. Some of the names that showed up was a woman from New York named Genevieve Lynch. She's on the board of directors of the National Iranian American Council, which has been identified as a potential foreign agent for the government of Iran.
U.S. Federal Election Commission records show that there are dozens of Arab and Muslim Americans, some with ties to anti-Israel groups, who contribute to J Street's Political Action Committee.
The IRS released perhaps by accident, J Street's tax forms, and there was $250,000 of donations from Mr. Soros.
George Soros is a billionaire investment manager who is a major supporter of far-left political causes and organizations. He has spoken out against Israel and provides large donations to anti-Israel organizations.
It turns out that George Soros was the main donor behind the organization, and Jeremy Ben-Ami lied about that for several years.
%50 of their budget came from outside the United States, a fact that they hid and lied about until it was made public some years later.
$800,000 from a woman in Hong Kong. I have no clue why this woman, a Philippine woman who lives in Hong Kong near the racetrack, was giving J Street a third of their budget 2 years ago. Something is amiss here.
J Street's critical approach toward Israel and its impatience with the lack of peace is reflected in J Street co-founder Daniel Levy's questioning the value of having a Jewish homeland.
If we're all wrong and a collective Jewish presence in the Middle East can only survive by the sword, it cannot be accepted. It's not about what we do. Sound familiar? They hate us for what we are, not what we do. If that's true, then Israel really ain't a very good idea.
I find that last comment by Levy just stunning.
I mean, if the Jews learned anything from the Holocaust, is that if we don't live by the sword, we might not live. So what in the world is he talking about?
Right, and by the way, the Jews don't want to live by the sword.
No.
But you're not required to commit suicide.
No.
And you know, very often J Street talks about, and Ben-Ami talks about Jewish values. And at one point in the film, Alan Dershowitz does say this. By the way, Alan Dershowitz is in the film, Daniel Gordis is in the film, Ruth Weiss is in the film. But Alan Dershowitz says at one point, the preeminent Jewish value is pikuach nefesh, which means saving life. There is an absolutely overriding Jewish value that, with very, very minor exceptions, minor meaning only if somebody tells you you're supposed to kill somebody or else I will kill you, to the extent to which you have the moral courage, you must say, then kill me. But in any other circumstance, you are required, Jewish values are required to use whatever force is necessary, the minimum of force, but as much force as is necessary to protect yourself and your family and your family's family. And the Jewish principle in the Talmud is, no one has a right to say their blood is redder than yours. You have no right to say your blood is redder than theirs, but they don't have the right to say that their blood is redder than yours. And so that moment in your film where the man who helped create J Street says it wasn't a good idea, that was very telling, and I was so glad you put that in the film.
The major problem with J Street, from our point of view, is not that it holds left-wing points of view.
Exactly.
It's not that. It's that, all of us, when we grew up, were told the following thing. We're Jews in America. We're the diaspora. And our job is to support Israel. And we can be critical of Israel. We can be very critical of Israel. We can write op-eds in the New York Times against Israel, against the policies of Israel. Okay, we can do all that. But we don't live there. And our children are not subject to kidnapping, God forbid, or being and we don't ride the buses in the marketplaces, and we are not going to be on the front lines. So what we don't have the right to do is to use the power of American Jewry, which is substantial in some ways, to lobby the President of the United States and the administration of the United States to force the Israelis to do what they've decided not to do. And that's what J Street does. And that's the sin. And that's the red line, if I were going to draw a red line. That's what they do. They use the power of American Jewry to force the Jews, they try, to force the Jews of Israel. They circumvent Israeli democracy. That is not just arrogant, but it's imperialistic.
Again, you have said it perfectly. And if anybody were to ask me, what's the real, quote, sin of J Street, I would say it exactly as you have. And I want to say it in my words to see if you would agree with me. The Israeli people have the right to elect in duly organized, appropriate, legal, free elections their government. And once the Israeli people have elected a government, there's no excuse, there's no right, there's no privilege, there's no reason, there's no excuse. The American Jewish community has a right to say to Israel, we think you made a mistake. But to try to pressure our government, to pressure their government to do something is, to me, what you call the red line. At that point, there's nothing Jewish about that. There is a need to respect the integrity, not of the Israeli government, it's of the Israeli people. The Israeli people have chosen a government. If the government is wrong, it will fall, or if it lasts its entire term, it can be voted out of office. But to think that American Jews have the right to use the American administration to pressure Israel against its own government and its own people's will seems to me to be, as you say, it has crossed a red line, and that is something I know of no other organization in the Jewish community of America, no matter how left they are. No other organization does that. Now, I want to say two things. I want to say one thing. I think you've said it right. I wish, when you revise this movie, that it has to be made clearer, because you have identified something which in the movie is subtle. It shouldn't be subtle. It should have been the absolute hammer of this movie. And then I want to ask you to look at one more clip from me. I'm going to show Charles a clip from a meeting between Jeffrey Goldberg and Jeremy Ben-Ami, the president of J Street, that took place in 2010, where basically Jeffrey Goldberg said to Jeremy Ben-Ami, what right do you have to be involved? I want Charles to hear what Jeremy Ben-Ami's answer is, and then I want to hear what he has to say.
One of the fallacies of the debate in the American Jewish community is whether or not there is a right on the part of Jewish Americans to express opinions on this because they live here. And I think that is a fallacy. I think, first of all, we're Americans. So we have every right to express ourselves on American foreign policy as it relates to Israel. And as Jewish Americans, we happen to care a little bit more deeply about Israel. But as Americans, there's no question we have the right to express opinions when it comes to policy in the Middle East.
I don't think any Israeli would deny that. As an American whose tax dollars go to Israel, you have a right to talk about that.
But I also think that the state of Israel is the state of the Jewish people, and they talk about it that way. Whether you live there or not, they will say, and the government officials would say, we are a state that does represent you. We are the national expression of our people, whether you live here or not. And so I do believe that as a Jew who lives here, whose life and experience here is impacted by the way that Israel is perceived and by the way that Israel acts, both as an American and as a Jew, that we do have a right to express our opinions and to talk about these issues publicly and openly.
But what if you're wrong? No. This is a serious question, and it's not a left or right question. It's both. What if you're wrong? Now, I put aside the American issue, because I understand that entirely. But as a Jew, this idea that Israel is the universal Jewish home and that every Jew has a stake, well, you don't really have a stake by comparison to your cousin who lives in Tel Aviv. Your kids don't have to go to the army. You're not paying taxes. And more to the point, if you advocate for a policy here that turns out to be the wrong policy for Israel's security, for instance, and this is true, this could be true of Meretz USA, and it could be true of Likud USA, you're not going to suffer the consequences of that policy decision. So it seems a little bit vicarious. And this, by the way,
I don't know if I agree with that, though. Okay. I think that there is a very serious impact for Jewish communities around the world by how Israel behaves and how it's perceived. And I think that if I may be wrong. Let me just say that up front, that I think it's very wrong for anybody to argue that they own the sole truth And I think any side of this argument has to be honest and say,
Every single Israeli I've met owns the sole truth, though. That's the thing.
But I think that, let me just say that up front, that it is very possible that I'm wrong. But I also think if I'm right, that the route that we are on right now and the path that Israel is following is one that will lead it to become more and more of a pariah state, more and more isolated, more and more demonized. And I worry about the impact of that on the Jewish people around the world. So I do think we have a stake. I do think our place in our community is impacted by the way that Israel as a state behaves.
Very
interesting. Isn't that interesting?
Very interesting.
And I'm so glad I have you here to answer it, because what Jeremy Ben-Ami is arguing is that what Israel does and how Israel is perceived around the world does impact the way in which he says, I'm not saying I agree.
Yeah.
He's arguing that the way Israel behaves can have an effect on the way American Jews are treated.
That's true. And I would want to flip that on him. So first of all, do Jews have a stake in Israel? Sure we do. And are Jews impacted by the events in the Middle East? Sure they are. But they're more impacted by the perception of the events in the Middle East. And what Jeremy Ben-Ami ought to do is to use his very considerable and seasoned skills as a PR person to help us fight the misperception of Israel that is daily raining down on us in the pages of the New York Times and on CNN, etc. So it's not that he ought to know better. It's not that we're doing bad things there. We're not doing bad things there. They're doing bad things. The other side is doing bad things. He never says anything about the other side. He wants to, by what standard is he judging Israel?
But that's also not exactly true. One of the things that your film does, and I thought very effectively, is it shows some of his speeches. By the way, you have a note in the credits that he declined to participate. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. And by the way, I should say we have been in touch with Jeremy Ben-Ami. He is going to come and sit at this table as well. And my own feeling is that Jeremy Ben-Ami has every right to express himself. He's not coming to talk about the film. He'll be joining us simply because I want to ask him some of the same questions I'm asking Charles. I want to hear what he has to say, and you have a right to hear what he has to say. And I'm sorry he didn't appear in your film, but you do quote him in the film. And one of the things he does is, at one point early in the film, is in your film, he gives a litany of all the things that the Palestinians have done negatively, hurtfully, to the Jewish people. And he describes the extent to which he acknowledges. I don't think anybody on J Street doesn't acknowledge the extent to which the people of Israel have been subject to horrendous behavior. So I don't think that's quite a fair criticism of him.
Well, I do think it is, because I think he does say the problems of Israel in our film, they're surrounded by Lebanon and by Egypt and by Iran and by Jordan and by this, and this is a problem, and there have been, but he, in order to change the impact, the negative impact on the diaspora Jewry, what we have to do is to convince the rest of the world that we're in the right, and that, relatively speaking, we're not amongst the cruelest of nations, right? We're amongst the best of nations. Why doesn't Jeremy say that? Because he's afraid that we're going to lose the rhetorical battle, and he wants to. His way out is to say, well, if we concede and we make these concessions, then the rest of the world will not give us a negative impact.
Okay, but he never says that. You're assuming that, right?
Well, you can.
He never says we should sort of make an intellectual concession here.
No, he never says that.
No.
But he makes the intellectual concession. You know, Alan Dershowitz went over every one of J Street's press releases from the time it started till when he made the statement was a few months ago, Dershowitz. And he never saw Jeremy Ben-Ami praising Israel. That's what he says. He only criticizes Israel. He sounds like the New York Times. He sounds like our adversaries on campus. So if he's worried about the impact on Jews, about what's happening in the Middle East, then my goodness, we can make a wonderful case that we're great. We're doing wonderfully well. And you know, you and I could list for days all the wonderful things that is, and we could also list for days all the terrible things that our adversaries are doing. So
Yeah.
that's what he ought to expend his wonderfully seasoned and experienced PR skills fighting that battle.
Why don't you think he does that?
But I think he's.
And now I am asking you for
Yeah.
speculation outside the film.
Yeah. So one never knows another person's
That's
motivation.
right. That's fair.
My best guess is that he's a universalist. He's a globalist, and he thinks that. Look, I have to say that anti-Israelism, which we face, which is the preeminent danger to Jews, he's right. Anti-Israelism is the preeminent danger to Jews. Is a derivative of the politically correct culture. Okay, so if you believe the axioms and the presuppositions of political correctness, all people are the same, all cultures are the same, no one culture is better than others, darker skinned people have a higher moral claim, poorer people have a higher moral claim, we're all reasonable, no mother would want her son to die unnecessarily. If you believe all that, Israel's going to come out bad, right? If you're a universalist and you believe those things, then sure, if they are like us, and let me finish, if they are like us and we made these concessions, well, they will act like we would act if somebody made a concession.
Okay, but wait,
I think he
I
believes
understand
that.
what you're saying. The only thing I disagree is, I still think Israel comes out on top. I think an honest universalist still thinks Israel is the best thing going. And we have made concessions, and they have made concessions.
Right.
And by the way, at the moment, we just had somebody on. Why was it escapes my thought at the moment? Who was it? But he said, Malcolm Hoenlein. The wife of a Hamas leader is being treated in an Israeli hospital.
Right.
Israeli hospitals care for Palestinians and even terrorists all the time. By the way, Palestinians try to get into Israel for medical care. Right. There is something extraordinary about the universalism of the Jewish people in the state of Israel. So the only thing I was going to say was, don't be so. I'm not ready to concede that there's any moral high ground to a universalist, and that in a universalist world, Israel comes out second. I believe even if you're a universalist, Israel is the model. Well, who's doing better than Israel?
The flaw of what we call today's universalism is that it says that all cultures are the same.
And they're
all
not,
values
right?
are the
That's
same,
correct.
and they're not.
That's correct.
So.
That's correct. All right, we've identified, you identified, that the thing that upsets you most is what upsets me most, that J Street is predicated on a notion that it can influence Israeli policy by using the United States government to pressure. What's their second worst thing?
Well, I think their second worst thing is that they echo the rhetoric against Israel, which is they put all of the blame and all of the responsibility for the conflict on Israel's shoulders.
Okay, you may be right.
Yeah.
It is not documented in the film. I want to tell you the second worst thing that I saw documented in your film, and you tell me if you agree with it. I believe a Jew has every right to be very critical of Israel if they think Israel is wrong.
Sure.
I don't think that you have a right to be involved in the BDS movement. A movement to destroy Israel through boycott, sanctions, divestment is really pure anti-Semitism that is not trying to improve Israel or help Israel. It's trying to destroy Israel. And what your film shows is that while J Street has never taken a formal stand within the BDS movement, it has honored and given platform to people who are part of the BDS movement. I'm now speaking for myself. For me, that's the second problem I have with J Street. Do you feel any way in the same way?
Yes. Yes. I mean, he would tell you when you have him here, he'll say, I'm against BDS, and I invite them into, and I give them platforms so that I can confront them. That's what he'll say. By the way, he won't, BDS says awful, awful things about Israel, much worse than I've said about Jeremy Ben-Ami.
Correct.
But he won't give us the same platform.
Okay. This is the only other piece of the film I want to show our audience. This is a piece that will show you the BDS piece of Charles's film, and it is what troubles me about J Street, and I will have no hesitation to share that when Jeremy comes and sits at this table. But Sloan, let's see that clip for a minute.
This is Sarah Beninga, a leader in the Sheikh Jarrah Solidarity Movement, which provokes confrontations with the IDF and seeks to remove Jews from areas in East Jerusalem. Beninga's group has endorsed boycott, divestments, and sanctions against Israel. She was honored at the J Street 2011 National Conference.
We invited to our conference a BDS activist to defend the BDS movement, the head of Jewish Voice for Peace. I'm very proud that she was at our conference.
The Anti-Defamation League considers Jewish Voice for Peace to be a leading anti-Zionist group promoting divestment, boycott, and sanctions against Israel, using their Jewishness to provide credibility to anti-Israel forces. In the 2012 United States congressional elections, J Street supported several congressmen who J Street claims are pro-Israel. One of these is Michigan Democrat John Dingell, who was one of only 2 congressmen to vote against the 2012 U.S.-Israel Enhanced Security Cooperation Bill, which passed by a vote of 411 to 2.
I want to understand, when you create a film with that kind of information, it's very important, very helpful. And I've been honest with you. I think a lot of the film is really anti-two-state solution. And I think Jeremy Ben-Ami, I think any American Jew who's in favor of the two-state solution has every right to do it. I think if they have an unrealistic view, from my perspective, of whether there is, in fact, a Palestinian on the West Bank who's going to make peace with them. You know, I've got Ken Bob sitting here. You know, I've got Eric Yaffe sitting here. I've got people who are very pro-Israel, but who see it differently, and they believe that Mahmoud Abbas really wants to make peace. I don't see it, but I don't want to criticize the essence of their Jewish soul, nor do I think that they have crossed any line. If they disagree with me and say, no, Mark, you don't understand, Mahmoud Abbas is really a partner for peace. Ehud Olmert said it. He's an Israel, and whether I like Olmert or not is not the point. This is a man who is prime minister of the state of Israel, who says that Mahmoud Abbas is ready to make peace. I think he's wrong, but I don't want to rule him out because of that. And so my own feeling is that one has to be very, very careful how one criticizes or where one criticizes J Street. And I think that J Street, which is basically hammering two-state solution, if that's where they stopped, I'd have no problem with them.
We wouldn't either. We wouldn't have made the film. By the way, in the film you have Alan Dershowitz, who is for a two-state solution.
That's right.
He's a very
and he's against
large,
the settlements.
And he's against the settlements. He's a very large presence in the film.
That's right.
So it's, I think the film, making a film for a Jewish audience is not an easy thing. Everyone who likes the film says, I would have put this in the front. Why didn't you put that Arafat stole the money? Why did you put that in the back? Yeah. So, but I have to say that we have had, I think the New York screening will be the 39th screening around the country. We're barnstorming around the country, and we've hit the NFL cities. And the response has been enormously powerful. And Jeremy Ben-Ami, who first came out and said, we're not going to waste 1 minute criticizing this film because it's full of lies and distortions. And then we said, well, name one. Couldn't. And then stage 2 of his response was to send out his friends in the media to bash our film, I think not effectively. But the film has gotten traction. And so finally, Jeremy has been forced to answer our film point by point by point, and there are going to be dueling op-eds in the Times of Israel about this.
Interesting.
But I have to say, we've had over 100 requests from Jewish communities around the country. It's been very hard sometimes to get the film in JCCs and in synagogues, because Jeremy now makes the point, hey, I'm in the big tent, and you can't have one Jewish organization criticizing another inside the big tent. So sometimes we're able to get into the JCCs, and sometimes we rent a theater.
Okay. The one thing I do want to know is whether you think you are you preaching to the choir? Because it seems to me that what you want from your film is a film which will be persuasive for those who are on the fence,
Yeah.
or who are uneducated, don't know. But if you're preaching to the choir, and I have to tell you the way the film came to me was from somebody in your choir. So they were they're already there. They would make us sound like we were being too moderate. So the question is your film only of interest to people who are predisposed before they walk through the door to be anti-J Street?
I think let me say two things. First of all, the people in the choir need to know how to say these things as wonderfully as the preeminent spokespeople.
Good for you.
So it's training the choir.
You're
So that's the
right.
first thing.
Okay.
So you can only make a film for so many different purposes. It can't both
Yes,
be
I
for
wanna
this
know what the
and for that.
but
and for
what
this.
is the purpose?
So the purpose is to inform the Jewish community about J Street and to teach them how to deal with J Street's rhetoric. People didn't know what J Street was. As Dershowitz on the film says, people think they hear J Street, peace, wonderful, etc. Somebody needed to show what their positions were, what their funding was, and how they circumvent Israeli democracy.
Charles Jacobs, would you include J Street in the Big Tent?
I would not. I would not. Because of the red line.
I want you to tell our audience again, because there are going to be people who are going to want to be at the Lowe's AMC between 68th and 67th on Broadway to see the J Street Challenge. When can they do that?
They can do it on June 26th at 7 o'clock.
Thursday night?
Thursday night.
Okay.
And they can buy tickets at thejstreetchallenge.com.
7 p.m.?
7 p.m.
Okay. It is a film that is very, very intriguing. It's a film that has, by the way, fabulous people in it. I am very pleased, from my perspective, that certain points were made. You've heard my problems with the film, but overall, to be able to see at certain points what J Street does, what J Street says, that is problematic. And maybe it's not problematic for you. You have the right to also look at the film and say, it's interesting. I don't agree with Charles. I don't agree with Mark. I see it differently. And again, that's why one of the things I think it's important. I wish the film had Jeremy, and I'm glad that Jeremy's coming to sit at this table. But I want to say, Yasha Koach, you have made extraordinary contributions time and time again to the Jewish world. We talked really only about the J Street Challenge. I wish I could get you back here to really talk more about your overview and some of the things you've done that you've touched on. Because the contribution you've made to Jewish life and the contribution you're making with the J Street Challenge can impact the Jewish future and really impact the state of Israel. Kol tuv v'hatzlacha, and thank you for making this trip. It was a real honor to meet you. You're an extraordinary human being. Thank you. Thank you. Charles Jacobs, head of Americans for Peace and Tolerance and special consultant for the film The J Street Challenge. And again, you can see it 7 p.m. Thursday, June 26th at the Lowe's AMC on Broadway between 68th and 67th. My thanks, as always, to everyone who is involved in this program, to Naomi Vilko for helping arrange our meeting with Charles Jacobs. Thanks to our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, and our producer, Carol Lilienthal. As always, be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to this entire discussion with Charles Jacobs. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from many of you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish Education in Media.